Dr. Walford, I want to ask you first a handful of questions about BPL prior to the medicines inspection report.
Right.
And I'm going to ask you about some matters which predate your time, but which you have at least referred to in a document you authored, and which so you may have picked up upon these matters from your subsequent involvement. If you're not able to assist, then obviously you'll say so. So it's really looking at the position by the second half of the 70s with BPL in quite general terms. First of all, looking at an extract from Dr. Lane's draft witness statement. So if we could go, Shomik, to CBLA 605, please. Might be 605_002, actually, sorry. So it's draft proof of evidence of Richard Spencer Lane, and if we go to page 74, I just want to pick up on a couple of paragraphs. So 180, Dr. Lane says this: the problem was that the basic infrastructure of BPL remained one which was appropriate to a laboratory engaging in research and relatively small-scale production. The buildings dating back to the 1950s were old, small, and not appropriately designed for manufacturing. Then he refers to the Medicines Inspectorate report, which we'll come on to, and then says, while still inadequate, it was now a facility for making a significant contribution to the increasing requirements of haemophiliacs for factor VIII concentrate. And then if we look at his next paragraph, he sets out some observations by Dr. Maycock from what I think was Dr. Maycock's valedictory statement when he retired. Dr. Maycock saying this: there is perhaps a moral to be drawn from the building history of the present BPL. 1954 building planned in 1949-52 mainly as a civil defence project to prepare freeze-dried large pool UVL irradiated plasma. The preparation of plasma, which was abandoned during erection of the building in favour of a return to freeze-dried 10 donor small pool plasma. The potential value of plasma fractions had not been appreciated in any countries, and a combination of a fractionation was included only as an afterthought. 1962 extension, a make and mend operation, which by moving the bacteriology and enlarging the small pool plasma laboratories relieved some of the pressures on the laboratory which were becoming intolerable. And then 1972 extension, this enlargement originated from the relatively immense need for immunoglobulin to prevent rubella in exposed pregnant women. Later it was decided that the plan should include means for meeting the estimated needs of factor VIII concentrate, and later still that the building should accommodate means for fractionating all plasma, and that freeze-dried small plasma should be replaced by albumin and PPF. He says it was now known that the estimates for factor VIII concentrate and albumin concentrate on which the plan was based were totally inadequate. Planning completed in 1965 was affected by the severe constraints imposed by the site, and in spite of these impediments, reductions in floor space were nevertheless imposed by the department. Now that's one description. I'm not going to ask you about details of it, but there's a broad description there. And now I want to go to a document authored by, I think, by you, which also looks at the position in the 70s. It's DHSC 0002305_011. Now, if we look at the top, this is a draft ministerial submission.
Yes.
It was amended quite substantially before the final submission went to ministers, and we'll look at a later stage at the final submission. But we can see someone's handwritten on there by D. Walford, 19th of December 1979. And I think there are other documents that refer to you producing a draft. So is it right to understand that this is a document that you authored?
When I saw this, I was given this. I think I produced quite a bit of what's in the draft, and I think that top page which says by D. Walford, is probably the sort of historical perspective and discussing what products were being produced was me. Subsequently, I can see bits of this draft that will have been administrative colleagues and not me. So I think it was, as often happened, an amalgam but certainly that front page will have been me.
Well, I only want to ask you about the historical perspective
Okay.
currently, so that's useful to know. Bottom of the page, therefore, we can see history of the BPL. 1952, a unit was set up at Elstree to undertake research, we'll go to the next page, and development in the field of blood products and to manufacture freeze-dried plasma. The unit was managed by the Medical Research Council but funded entirely by the department. Subsequently, methods of processing plasma were developed which yielded preparations containing specific individual components of blood, such as the clotting factor, factor 8. In the 1960s, the unit greatly expanded its rate of production of such products, and in 1972, a new unit, the present BPL, was commissioned. In 1975, following a decision by Dr. David Owen that there should be much less reliance on commercial sources of blood products, particularly factor 8, £500,000 was allocated from central funds to regional blood transfusion centres to produce more plasma for processing at BPL. Production at BPL therefore expanded far beyond the level which had been allowed for in its design and beyond that which could be considered reasonable for safe production. In 1976, the Medical Research Council ceased to manage the BPL since it was felt that the unit had become less of a research laboratory and more of a production unit, in effect a factory. Management was transferred to the Lister Institute of Preventive Medicine, one of whose activities was the manufacture of vaccines. The Lister Institute appeared content to leave the manufacturing aspect of the BPL almost entirely in the hands of its director, Dr. Maycock, later Sir William Maycock, who was also consultant advisor in blood transfusion to the department. Just pausing there, so he was Dr. Tovey's predecessor.
Mm-hmm.
The first intimation that the laboratory had serious shortcomings followed informal visits by the medicines inspectors in 1977, but Dr. Maycock advised the department that there were serious doubts that the inspectorate standards for pharmaceutical manufacture could or should be applied to the manufacture of blood products. Dr. Maycock's views had the support of several regional transfusion directors, perhaps because they feared that the same standards might also be applied to the preparation of various blood components produced by the regional centres themselves. Further criticism of the laboratory's capability and manufacturing conditions was voiced by Dr. Richard Lane shortly after his appointment as Deputy Director and Director Designate in 1977. Later that year, the department met Dr. Maycock and Dr. Lane at the BPL and asked them to begin to plan for the phased redevelopment of the BPL. More immediately, they were asked to plan for necessary improvements, a so-called stopgap development, which would remedy the laboratory's worst shortcomings and lead to an increased output of factor 8 and albumin. The increased output was felt to be essential since the BPL was only supplying about 1/3 of the NHS requirement for blood products, the shortfall being met by the purchase of costly commercial products to the tune of several £1 million per year. In 1977, the inadequacies of the Lister Institute as a production unit management was starkly revealed by a formal inspection by the Medicines Inspectorate, culminating in the closure of the Lister Institute's own vaccine manufacturing unit at Elstree. So that's the Medicines Inspectorate, not to be confused with the later inspection of BPL itself. That's the Medicines Inspectorate inspecting the Lister Institute's facilities. And then the paragraph 11, the BPL had not yet been formally inspected, so that the demise of the Lister Institute did not affect the running of the BPL, except that a new management structure had to be devised. And then we see the reference there to the Joint Management Committee and the Scientific and Technical Committee. And then paragraph 12, both committees endorsed fully the need to implement the stopgap proposals for improving the laboratory. The implementation of these plans was deferred since it was known that the laboratory was shortly to be inspected, and it was possible that the stopgap proposals would conflict with the anticipated requirements by the Inspectorate for improvements to the laboratory. And then you go on to talk about the report by the medicines inspectors. So I just wanted to stop there in terms of the history. Now, this won't have been, for the most part, material from your own direct knowledge. You'll have gleaned this from Dr.
Yes.
Lane or sources within the department.
Sources, yes.
But it's accurate to the best of your knowledge.
Yes.
And so I just want to put three things to you and ask for your comment, ask if you agree with them. Would you agree with this? Firstly, that it was or should have been known to all those involved in relation to BPL in the second half of the 1970s that the demand for blood products was rising?
Yes.
Secondly, it was or should have been obvious that BPL was outdated and too small, and that significant investment was required in order to be able to meet the rising demand.
Yes.
And thirdly, the government had determined that BPL should meet equivalent standards to commercial plants, notwithstanding Crown immunity, but it was or should have been obvious that BPL would not meet those standards.
That's right.
And as we saw referred to in that document, by the time you first became involved, and I think we can certainly trace you having some involvement by the beginning of 1979, whilst you're still in the medicines division, possibly in the course of 78 as well. But BPL had devised this stopgap programme,
Yes.
intended to allow for upgrading the plant, to allow for an increase in production in preparation for a bigger redevelopment.
Yes.
And then we're going to look at the implications then of what then happened.
Yes.
Dr. Walford, over the but immediately before and then following the Medicines Inspectorate report. So I want to pick things up in January of 1979 with a meeting that you attended. Seamus, it's DHSC 0002191_067. We can see it's the Joint Management Committee for the Central Laboratories meeting on the, I think that's the 21st of January, 21st of February 1979. And we can see that you're in attendance. There's Dr. Glass, Mr. Bricken, Dr. Walford, Mrs. Yule. Now, this is before you've joined SEB. So in what capacity were you attending this meeting?
Are we able to go a bit further down to remind myself? Because basically Dr. Waiter was doing my job that I got there.
Yes, and Dr. Waiter's there. We can see her under Dr.
So I must have been there for some other reason to do with Medicines Division. I was there representing Medicines Division. Undoubtedly, there was nothing else I could be representing. It depends. Are you going to go through?
Well, and it may assist you in answering the question. So if we go to page 3, we can see bottom half of the page. There's a subheading progress with the setting up of the Scientific and Technical Committee. So we can see that that's being set up, reference there to Dr. Waiter and Mr. Dutton being joint secretaries. Then bottom of the page, and this may be why you were there, Dr. Walford, I don't know, the requirements of the Medicines Act and the conditions which BPL and PFL would be required to fulfil. Dr. Walford asked for the committee's agreement to withdraw the document entitled Standards for the Collection and Processing of Blood and Blood Components and the Manufacture of Sterile Fluids in the NBTS. She drew the committee's attention particularly to the requirements of HSC IS 144, recommended that the Regional Health Authority should formally designate Dr. Lane as the person responsible. Dr. Harris pointed out that although the same licensing requirements did not apply to the NHS as to industry, successive Secretaries of State had emphasised that the NHS should be required to attain the same standards as manufacturing industry. Dr. Walford explained that the procedures which BPL had developed for the manufacture of albumin would require to be approved by the appropriate subcommittee of the Committee on the Safety of Medicines. And then there's also reference to the possibility of having to seek a product licence for albumin. And then, although there's some markings on this, it says Dr. Walford said she expected to make her formal visit to the BPL in April and to PFL somewhat later. Mr. Harley asked what the situation would be if Medicines Division recommended changes for which there was no financial provision. Dr. Harris explained that in this case the options would have to be put to ministers. Yes. Does that help in understanding why you were there?
Well, obviously I seemed to be there to provide whatever information I could about the role of product licensing, if you like, of what is required formally under the Medicines Act for factor VIII or albumin production. I think somewhere later on, I don't know whether you want to deal with it now, that I dealt with the whole subject of whether BPL products were formally licensed by the licensing authority. But essentially, I had obviously been invited here. Unfortunately, I cannot remember at all what was in HSC IS 144, something to do with standards in blood transfusion centres. The question which was going to be considered was whether the Medicines Inspectorate needed to inspect regional transfusion centres as well as inspecting BPL, and I think that was an issue. I don't know why I might have suggested that the document that was referred to just over the page should be withdrawn, but clearly it was accepted by the committee that it should be withdrawn. And unless I saw what was in that document, I really can't comment. I really don't know.
But this appears to envisage that you be making a formal visit to BPL.
Yes.
And the reference is April. We know April was the medicines inspection visit.
Yes.
Would you normally be part of a medicines inspection visit? I know you've told us about the visit to the States.
Well, I don't know whether I was or I wasn't. Clearly, it seemed to imply that I was going to be making a formal visit. I don't think I, on my own, would be making a formal visit. Maybe I accompanied the medicines inspectorate. I simply don't remember at this remove. As I say, I went around BPL quite a bit. This is very early on in my, as it were, relationship with BPL, because this is February 79.
Yes.
I hadn't actually started in my new job. I didn't even know I was getting the new job in Med-SEB. So what it might have been was that I was needing to visit BPL so that I knew what I was talking about if I was called upon to talk about something by the inspectorate. But it could have been that I went on the visits. I really can't remember. I don't know if you've got any papers which suggest that I did. I haven't seen any.
I don't think we've got any one way or another that answers that question, Dr. Walford. So don't worry if you can't remember. We'll look at what the inspection report said in any event in due course. Just want to ask you next to look at a meeting from March 1979. Now, this is one you weren't at.
Yes.
Which is BPLL 0008430_001. And we can see it's a meeting of the Scientific and Technical Committee for the Central Laboratories, 26th of March 1979. It appears to be the first meeting of the Scientific and Technical Committee. I'll come back to the membership of that when we look at some of the meetings that you attended. But if we go a little further down, we'll see joint secretaries included Dr. Sheila Waiter, so your predecessor in Med-SEB. And then if we go to the second page... just want to really to then ground what comes next, look at some of the discussion here. So second paragraph refers to Dr. Lane outlining the constraints on the development of BPL and reference to the department purchasing the site. And then there's then a discussion about usage. And then the next paragraph records Mr. Smart. And Mr. Smart was a member of the committee who was himself, I think, involved with the pharmaceutical industry.
Glaxo.
He was a senior advisor with Glaxo. Pointed out that with the expenditure of this order likely to be incurred, there appeared to be every incentive on economic grounds for speedy investment aimed at optimising factor VIII production at BPL. Yeah. And we'll pick this up in later documents, Dr. Walford, when we look more closely at your involvement. But I think it's right to say Mr. Smart, certainly from this stage onwards, notwithstanding or perhaps because of his own experience working in the private sector, was very firmly of the view that there was a strong economic case for BPL to be redeveloped as an NHS vaccination centre without private industrial participation, wasn't he?
That's absolutely right, and he was absolutely right.
So we can see from the beginning of the Scientific and Technical Committee, that's Mr. Smart's view. And then if we go to the next page, top of the page, we can see Dr. Dunhill. I'm not sure if you can assist us with who that was.
He was a scientist, a biomedical engineer at UCL.
And he says he reminded members he'd pointed out to the department some 12 months ago that it was improvident to expect the major BPL plant to continue to function much longer without major breakdown. And then again, we have Mr. Smart recommending the need for planning for the future. And then we can see Dr. Lane pointing out in the next paragraph that the stopgap programme, which was designed to give maximum production capacity essentially within the constraints imposed by existing plant and premises, was not capable of being repeated, and there was an urgent need for the planning of substantial additional capacity. Now, not going to go into the details of everything else that was discussed, but, and I'm conscious you weren't there, but would it be right to understand that really it's being made very clear by members of the Scientific and Technical Committee in March of 1979 that this was something that needed to be urgently addressed?
Yes.
And then if we just look at the very bottom of the page, there's a paragraph there referring to Dr. Gunson, and he talks about the possibility of looking at two distinct functions in which BPL was engaged. The first was essentially a research and development role, and then the second was a routine production process turning out large quantities of plasma proteins by established methods. He wondered whether there was a place for industrial participation in the latter process. Now, one of the themes I'm going to want to explore with you tomorrow morning, probably, is the consideration that was given by the department to commercial industrial involvement in BPL.
Yeah.
This appears to be a tentative suggestion, a wondering by Dr. Gunson. Do you know from either your own recollection or the material you've read whether this was something that had been floated as an idea prior to this?
The only thing that I knew about, that I can recall now, and from the papers that I've seen, was a paper by Dr. Waiter shortly before, and it was probably August, just before I joined.
We're going to come to that, yes.
So that's where I think I first... Was I at this meeting?
You weren't at this particular meeting.
That's when I think I first became aware, probably, that there were considerations of should there be commercial participation in some form or another.
Well, we'll come to that very shortly. Just before we do that, I just want to invite your attention to a document produced by Mr. Smart. So one of the agreements of the Scientific and Technical Committee was on this date was that Mr. Smart would produce a report looking at options for BPL.
Right.
And it's CBLA 0001004_004. And we can see it's headed Blood Products Laboratory Redevelopment, and he explains in the first paragraph that at the meeting we just looked at, he undertook to prepare a short paper seeking to apply the techniques of evaluation of alternative strategies which would be used in an industrial context. And then he sets out three, if we go back to the main page, he sets out three basic courses of action. One, close down production of blood products in the National Blood Transfusion Service and acquire all supplies of necessary fractions from external commercial sources. So forget NHS product, commercial product only. Two, continue production of a proportion of the country's needs on one footing or another, making good any shortfall by purchase from commercial suppliers. So that's, as it were, the maintenance of the status quo. Continued production might be, A, at the present levels of capacity within BPL with no further injection of capital and with expenditure limited to essential repairs and replacements as they became absolutely unavoidable, or B, at the raised levels to be achieved by the implementation of the stopgap programme, but with no thought of further expansion. So option two is maintain the status quo, perhaps with some modest improvements. I mean, that's my paraphrasing. And then option three, bring BPL up to the standards and operating capacity which one would expect to find in a purpose-built industrial unit capable of meeting the entire national requirement for blood products. So 3 years, complete redevelopment. And he goes on, I'm not going to go through the detail of it, but to set out, in very broad terms, the cash flow, he calls it, the economic case in relation to each. And if we just go to page 4, second half of the page is his evaluation of option 3, which is complete redevelopment. And he says, bottom of the page, this pattern shows, as might be anticipated, that there's a rapid and growing return on the investment with all the capital expenditure paid back in the first 15 months of full-scale operation. And essentially he's talking about you'd save your money that you're spending on commercial concentrates and you'd get that money back, put crudely.
Yes.
Do you know whether, when you took over the job a few months later, did you see Mr. Smart's report?
I certainly saw it. I think I saw it during the course. I don't exactly know when I saw it, but I certainly saw it probably fairly early on. Yes.
And what was your view of what he was saying?
He was spot on.
Now, we then have the medicines inspection, a medicines inspectorate inspection, April of 1979, I think. And then if we look at the conclusions of the medicines division following the inspection, it's at DHSC 0001812. So this isn't the full inspection report, but I think it summarises the most salient points. First paragraph, BPL was developed in stages over a number of years as new products were introduced, new buildings were erected to facilitate their manufacture. Paragraph 2 talks about how as production increased, it could not readily be adapted to large-scale manufacture. And then if we just carry on down the page, I'm just going to alight on some of the points. Paragraph 4 raises an issue about the personnel who've not had the opportunity to gain experience of modern large-scale sterile production requirements in the pharmaceutical industry. 5, production is now on a scale which must be regarded as a large-scale factory-type operation and has outgrown the premises in which it's undertaken. 6, the laboratory is so short of space for cold storage, quarantine of raw materials, in-process materials and finished products, receipt and dispatch, packaging and warehousing generally, that it's not practical or safe to increase throughput, even if the necessary production facilities were available. For these reasons, it's not practicable to consider a double shift system of working if it were possible to employ the appropriate additional staff. And then this, if this were a commercial operation, we would have no hesitation in recommending that manufacture should cease until the facility was upgraded to a minimum acceptable level. And then over the page, the medicines division say at the top, however, as blood products are essential to the health and well-being of the nation and as alternative sources of supply are severely restricted, production at Elstree may continue provided certain aspects of the standards of production and control are improved immediately and that the planning of certain other essential improvements in these standards commences immediately with a view to very early implementation. And then we can see a number of recommendations, first of which is under no circumstances should production of any product be increased under the existing manufacturing conditions. Special need for the manufacture of freeze-dried plasma to be upgraded immediately by locating it elsewhere on the premises as the present facility is totally unacceptable. The alternative is to cease manufacture of this product as the operation as currently undertaken is microbiologically hazardous. And then paragraph 10 sets out a whole number of immediate measures that are said must be undertaken. I'm not going to go through each of those. Next page, halfway down, paragraph 11, planning of essential improvements must commence forthwith and take into consideration the following, and then reference to the present facility being totally unsuitable for the manufacture of sterile products, incapable of being upgraded to the required standards. B, the existing buildings would be suitable as or could be adapted for use as, and then it describes the kind of facilities that could be, as it were, housed in the existing buildings. And then C, a new factory-type manufacturing facility is required. And then the additional comment, bottom of the page, is the arrangements originally intended for increased production known as stopgap proposals should be proceeded with as quickly as possible to provide additional cold storage space, warehousing, goods receipt and dispatch, container washing and preparation, but only if such a development can be incorporated into a new manufacturing facility. However, in proceeding with stopgap, there should be no intention of increasing production in the present facility as it's already overloaded and seriously deficient in standards. And then there are some recommendations as to what could be done to address that. So it's a pretty damning report on BPL.
Yep.
Would you agree it's something which called out for urgent action?
Yes.
Do you happen to know why the inspection was taking place at that point in time and hadn't occurred earlier?
I don't know. I mean, from what we've said earlier, I think that there was some discussion in 1977. I don't know whether there were proper inspections then. I've no idea what why the inspectorate chose to inspect then. I really haven't seen anything that helps.
But what's being described is this fair as a state of affairs that wasn't new.
No.
These weren't recent developments, so it's
No.
something that must have been evident as a problem for some time.
I'm certain it was.
Now, again, just want to look, before we get to Dr. Waiter's memo to you as her successor, I just want to look at 3 other documents just to take us through the period from the inspection in around April 1979 to Dr. Waiter leaving and you joining in August, September of 1979. There's a meeting at CBLA 40952 of the Scientific and Technical Committee. So they meet on the 7th of June 1979. We can see that again that Dr. Waiter, as your predecessor, was present. And if we go to the 3rd page, we've got the heading, the development of BPL. There's reference to Mr. Smart's report, which I think is the report we looked at. There's reference to a memorandum by Dr. Lane. I'm not going to I'll ask you about that. There's then a discussion about Mr. Harley preparing a paper containing the department's appraisal of the options open to it. And then if we just look at the next paragraph, we can see Mr. Dunnell saying that he thought further papers wouldn't advance consideration of the problems facing BPL, which were already well identified. The options were, in his view, also quite apparent. He wondered whether the better course might be for the chairman to seek to see the Secretary of State and to express the committee's disquiet that nothing was being done to put the defects at BPL right. Several members doubted whether there could be a useful discussion with the Secretary of State until the appraisal which Mr. Harley proposed to cover in his paper had been carried out. And ultimately there's an agreement that Mr. Harley should go away and produce a paper before the matter's taken further. But would it be right to understand that at least from the position of the Scientific and Technical Committee in June 1979, they are now perhaps even more concerned that something needs to be done to address this because the medicines inspection has been so damning. And then if we look at BPLL 308488, again, this is before you've taken up the post. So it's the 13th of June 1979, and this is a meeting of the Joint Management Committee for Central Blood Laboratories. So Dr. Sheila Waiter, your predecessor, is there. But if we go to page 4, we can see about a third of the way down the page there's reference to the Scientific and Technical Committee meeting, which we've just looked at. And then if we go to the last paragraph, so the relationship of stopgap, if you have that paragraph, Dr. Walford, to the phased redevelopment of BPL was discussed. Mr. Harley invited members to consider the advisability of proceeding with stopgap in light of the Medicines Inspector's report. The committee was firmly of the view that the stopgap should go ahead. There was no reason why it should be incompatible with emergency measures to meet those shortcomings which could not be tackled immediately or with longer-term developments. There could be no question of replacing the laboratory for a number of years, and the stopgap development was therefore necessary. And then there's a discussion of how it could be funded. So, again, this is really just a place what's happening in context before you become involved. The Joint Management Committee's view was that the stopgap proposals and the stopgap work should continue. And then if we go to CBLA 40955, this is a letter from Mr. Harley, dated the 13th of July 1979, so in the Health Services Division of the DHSS, to Dr. Lane, confirming a telephone call. He says in the second paragraph, it is, as you know, likely that a report by the medicines inspectors will require at the very least some upgrading of the facilities at the Blood Products Laboratory. So it sounds as though the full report's not yet available. You also know that no money has been allocated for this purpose. We do not, of course, know at the moment what the cost of upgrading may be, but we could find ourselves in a situation where we should have to choose between upgrading and going ahead with the stopgap programme. I therefore think it would be advisable to avoid incurring any further stopgap expenditure until the financial position has been clarified. I need hardly say that this applies also to expenditure on the planning of the phased redevelopment of the BPL. I know what a disappointment this must be to you, but I'm sure you will agree it's the wisest course. So is it right to understand that the department is saying to BPL, no further expenditure until we've considered the bigger picture, as it were?
It's right to understand that Mr. Harley is saying that to BPL.
Yes, you're right to point that out. So, but it appears from the letter that Mr. Harley appears to think he has the authority to say that to Dr. Lane.
Well, I think he probably had the authority because his role was for the finances and the budget for BPL, and he also chaired, whether now or later on, the finance committee for this, which was advising the joint management committee. If I might say so, and I think subsequent papers will show, I think it was perhaps a misunderstanding on his part about how far the stopgap arrangements would go to improve quality. And I think he felt it looks as if, I don't know what he felt, but it looks as if he felt it was a dichotomous position. On the one hand, you did the stopgap. On the other hand, you made the remedial arrangements to fulfill the medicines inspectorate requirement. And I don't think that was like that. I mean, it was on a continuum, and I think that there was a lot in the stopgap proposals that would have gone a long way towards addressing the medicines inspectorate report. And frankly, and even looking back on this, as now I must, it's really hard to understand why that instruction, if you will, was issued, because it did hold things up, and it didn't need to, in my opinion.
So that brings us then to Dr. Waiter's memo to you. Oh, well, sorry, it's a memo to Dr. Oliver,
yes.
copied to you, but it's
yes.
her reflections moving on from the job.
Yes.
So if we go to DHSC 0002195_020, so it's dated the 23rd of August 1979. We don't need to go to the last page yet, but that's where the date is. And we can see it's addressed to Dr. Oliver, future supplies of blood products. She refers to visiting, is it KB,
yes.
AB in Stockholm, so a Swedish pharmaceutical company.
Yes.
And then she says, this visit, coupled with my imminent remove from Med SM4, so that's Med SEB, has prompted me to set down some of the problems as I see them of future supply of blood products and possible solutions. As you know, I was interested to visit Kabi because of their involvement in the manufacture of blood products and their interest in extending Kabi activities outside Scandinavia. They wish to build a plasma fractionation plant and approached us earlier to discuss the possibility, A, of building such a plant in the UK, and B, fractionating UK plasma on our behalf. And then there's reference to some discussions in April 1979. And then she says it's accepted that in order to meet the anticipated demand for the principal plasma fractions, factor VIII, and protein solutions, mainly albumin, new plant, in addition to that already available in the UK, must be acquired. With this in mind, plans for the future development of the blood products laboratory have been drawn up. In addition to increasing production, it will be necessary to upgrade existing plant to meet the requirements of the Medicines Act. Needless to say, any new plant will have to be built to the same specification. Just pausing there, do you know what plans she was referring to when she says plans for the further development of the blood products laboratory have been drawn up?
I'm wondering if maybe she was referring to the stopgap proposals, but I can't be certain.
Then she goes on to say there are a number of alternative schemes for making plasma derivatives available in sufficient quantities to meet the demands of UK clinicians, and some urgent discussions will be necessary. To meet the estimated demand, several possible alternative schemes have been described, others may become apparent. And so she sets out 5 options. 1, invest sufficient money in the BPL Elstree to build up its capacity to meet the level of demand for factor VIII levels in albumin. Production of other fractions at self-sufficiency levels will follow for almost all plasma derivatives. So do whatever you need to do to BPL to become self-sufficient, in other words, is option 1. Option 2, to re-examine the capacity present and potential at PFC Liberton and to see whether this could be developed to meet UK demands. So look to see whether you can develop the Scottish facility and whether they can fractionate material for the whole of the UK. 3, to seek a UK firm willing to undertake work under contract for the NHS and without profit. 4, to enter into a joint venture with a foreign or UK commercial enterprise. 5, not to invest in UK plant for the production of the major plasma derivatives, factor VIII and albumin, but to rely entirely on commercial sources, with the exception of PFL Oxford and PFC Liberton, who will continue at their present level of production. And then we can see she evaluates each of the options. Again, I'm not going to go through all of it, but I think it's probably quite important to see a lot of it. So option 1, she refers to a paper by Dr. Lane, which I haven't troubled you to look at today, and then to Mr. Smart. And she says this: the arguments given the money to invest appear convincing, but I would question whether there's sufficient expertise within the BPL, even within the NHS, to plan, build and commission a plant on the required scale. If this option is taken up, either staff of suitable calibre and experience should be recruited to BPL, or a firm with the necessary expertise should be contracted to plan, build and commission new plants. So in terms of redeveloping BPL as an NHS facility, she is doubtful that it can be done.
Doubtful, but has found a way in which it might be done. And I must say, I was sympathetic with the notion that you should be able to find a commercial company willing to provide the expertise to run under contract or to manage under contract this facility for the NHS.
And then option 2, and this was the option of looking to Scotland to help out. She says, I've been convinced for a considerable time that it's essential to make a coordinated UK approach to solving the self-sufficiency problem. Criticism has been levelled by the directors of BPL, past and present, at the plant at PFC Liberton and on occasion at the major products. Nevertheless, Scotland is better provided with protein solutions and factor VIII than England and Wales. The medicines inspectors have not yet visited or reported on PFC, but if the PFC proves to be satisfactory or more readily brought up to the required standards, then we should consider further investment there and manufacturing the major components at PFC. And then just going to the next paragraph, whatever option is pursued, DHSS must examine the potential of PFC Liberton.
Yes.
And reference is made to some investment that's already been made. And then if we go to options 3 to 4, so this is the options of commercial companies effectively taking over BPL. Reference made to the goodwill of blood donors, so the UK's voluntary donation system, and she talks about the hazards associated with reliance on paid donors being well documented. If an enterprise outside the NHS undertakes to fractionate plasma on behalf of the NHS, then it's believed by many that the goodwill of donors will be lost to a significant extent and the blood transfusion service will suffer. This consequence is debatable. It's possible this situation could be avoided if a nationalised UK firm could be interested in fractionating plasma exclusively for the NHS. And then if we just the last sentence of that paragraph is important. However, at present, no UK firm appears to have the expertise nor the interest to enter the field of plasma fractionation. So that's Dr. Waiter's observation about the possibility of looking to a UK firm. And an alternative might be to interest a foreign firm. Some have already expressed an interest, and then she refers to KBAB, the Swedish firm. And she says, 2 paragraphs further down, again, with careful preparation, I believe this or a similar scheme could be presented in an acceptable way to the British blood donor. And then option 5, next page, which was rely entirely on commercial concentrates. She says, in the long term, this is unacceptable. Previous ministers have declared their intention that the UK should be self-sufficient. This policy is in line with WHO principles accepted by all nations with advanced medical care and would probably be the intention of present ministers. Now, just wanted to pick up on that latter point there. This is August 1979. There'd been a general election in presumably May of 1979. And so it would suggest, I think, if this is a fair reading of what Dr. Waite is saying, that she's anticipating that the new government would endorse the existing policy, but is not certain of it.
That's right.
And then if we just look at her summary, she says, to pursue any of the above options will bring major problems to which there are no easy solutions. Some have been touched on in this paper. Expenditure of several £1 million would solve a few, but the greater problems would remain: attitude of blood donors to what they might interpret as exploitation, the lack of expertise in the centres in which we might invest, the attitude of clinicians who look for increasingly large volumes of therapeutic materials. Some clearly have a responsible attitude to their use. Others, as in many other fields of clinical practice, wish their demands to be met without question or payment. However, in summary, I believe self-sufficiency can be reached one way or another if the problems can be overcome. Blood donors will cooperate when difficulties are explained to them. Expertise is available in the UK and Europe for planning and building and running a new fractionation plant. Clinicians' attitudes can be changed by education and by example, or in the last resort, by the constraints of limited resources. Now, you were... It doesn't tell us on this document, but I think I understand that you were sent a copy of this.
Yes, she gave me a copy.
And we'll look tomorrow morning at what an appraisal of options that you yourself came up with a few weeks into your new job. But can you recall what your reaction was to reading this? What you thought?
Well, this was obviously a very helpful background paper for me. I mean, essentially, I was able to use it as a quarry for my later. I quite early on, as you say, we're going to come to tomorrow. Made some proposals within the department to actually be getting on with things, and I used this paper as a very helpful background to my thinking.
Just going back to something we were discussing this morning, Dr. Walford, about the blurring of lines between administrative / policy and medical / scientific hierarchies. Would you agree that this is a fair comment, that what we've got here is Dr. Waiter as a medical civil servant, not waiting to be invited to comment upon policy options or limiting her advice to purely, as it were, the medical. She's putting forward possible policy solutions to a problem, is she not?
Yes, she is, but she's putting it forward within the medical hierarchy. And when, as we come to tomorrow maybe, when I put my suggestions forward, it was within the medical hierarchy, and it was only that I think Dr. Harris picked up what I was proposing and thought it should go wider. Otherwise, it wouldn't, at that stage anyway, have occurred to me that I could put it up and show it to the administrative colleagues as well.
So you and Dr. Waiter were free to make suggestions about policy directions, but you would ordinarily, unless it's a response to an invitation, you would be doing it within your medical hierarchy so that it could be taken up at a senior level.
Yes.
Or a more senior level.
Yes.
And then just before we leave for today, I just wanted to pick up upon what she says about clinical practice in the last two paragraphs. Last sentence of the penultimate paragraph, she talks about some clinicians having a responsible attitude to the use of therapeutic materials. Others, sorry, it's the paragraph before that, Shomek. Others wishing their demands to be met without question or payment. So I think perhaps they're referring to clinicians, possibly including haemophilia clinicians, who think they should be able to use whatever products they want as much as they want.
Yes.
And then in the last paragraph, she talks about how clinicians' attitudes can be changed by education and by example, or in the last resort by constraints of limited resources. So would it be fair to understand that Dr. Waiter's not necessarily saying, well, clinical freedom must be respected at all costs? We might be able to influence clinical practice by education, or if that doesn't work, by limiting the funding available.
Well, you certainly would hope that you could influence clinical practice by education. That's the whole point about medical education, medical training. You would expect to be able to influence practice, but of course not universally. Not everybody was paid the same attention maybe to elements of education, but absolutely you would expect that an educational effort would be helpful. Constraints of limited resources would always work, because you could never actually overcome that. If in fact the region said we're not going to buy X or Y product, there was nothing that the clinicians could do except maybe come to the department and complain they were not getting the material that they wanted. There was, resources have always been a restraint on clinical expenditure. They are now, they always were. So that was the ultimate lever, if you will. And some regional health authorities were actually rationing the amount of commercial factor VIII that they were prepared to provide compared with other regional health authorities, and very much depended on the particular population of a particular region and their particular view as to how much money they were prepared to pay for commercial factor VIII.
So I note the time. I was going to suggest now might be a good point to end for the day. There's a number of documents we'll need to look at in the morning, including Dr. Walford's own, as it were, response to this.
Yes, there's just one thing which if I may, I'd like to ask you about. It's a document we saw. It's a very minor point, and it is just for my understanding. Mm-hmm. But can we go back, please, Shumik, to BPLL 308488. It's the Joint Management Committee meeting of the 13th of June 1979. Can we go to page 4? Now, if we just look down to what is said about the Scientific Technical Committee, just stop there. Let me just see if I can find what I had in mind. Yes, the largest paragraph just towards the bottom of the page, beginning with the relationship of stopgap. If we look there, there's a sentence which said there could be no question of replacing the laboratory for a number of years. Mm-hmm. And the stopgap development was therefore necessary. Mm-hmm. It's the use of the word laboratory, which just is, I want to understand. Am I correct in thinking that at Elstree there had been both a laboratory facility and a production facility?
Yes. I mean, essentially, initially it began life almost as a research laboratory with a small production facility associated. And of course it was called the Blood Products Laboratory, so I think this is simply shorthand for BPL.
And the laboratory really hadn't done an awful lot of work for lack of finance during the 70s, as I understand it, dwindled off a bit, and the facilities were quite old.
The facilities were old, but they definitely were not adequate for any larger scale production. It was really, I think, and was over a period of time, quite remarkable how much the laboratory, BPL, managed to make when it was absolutely not set up to do that.
Now, the stopgap proposals were about production, were they?
Half and half. I mean, they were definitely about improving quality, but largely with a view to increasing, from memory, the amount of factor VIII that could be produced by about 12.5 million international units after 4 years. So that would be after 4 years, they'd have got to an additional 12.5 million international units. So certainly increasing production, but in the course of increasing production, a lot of quality improvements would have been made.
So when it says there's no question of replacing the laboratory, the stopgap development is related to the laboratory, is it?
The existing laboratory, yes. The existing BPL. There was then a thought that as well as doing stopgap, there should be a phased redevelopment. That was never really developed in a big way in terms of planning, because what became apparent pretty shortly, and especially after the Medicines Inspectorate report, was that actually the only way you were going to be able to proceed satisfactorily was with a complete replacement and building a whole new laboratory.
Yes. Thank you very much. Well, we'll take a break there and come back tomorrow at 10 o'clock. The same rules apply at this break as they do at any break, of course. But I look forward to seeing you back refreshed tomorrow at 10 o'clock.
Yes, thank you.